Hey everybody, my name is Trevor Ramey and this is going to be my research presentation. I did some research on an article called Behind the Transparent Wall by Hugo Caviola. I'll go ahead and tell you I'm going to try to move through this pretty quickly because there's a lot of information, and one of the things that was most interesting to me was actually who Caviola was, or who he became later on in life. So let's try to get at it here. All right, so over here on the left, you've got Mr. Hugo Caviola. He's the author of the article. And of course, over here, you've got, I'll turn my pointer here. Over here, you've got Miss Haushofer. And this is going to be a postmodern reading of the text. Again, I will talk a little bit more about Caviola later because he was interesting to me. Before we get into it, I'm sure everybody here has studied postmodernism to some degree, but just as a kind of a disclaimer, postmodernism is, difficult to define, but it often places value on complexities and contradictions and tends to question issues of reality, especially objective reality. And Calvin and Hobbes is amazing, so I put a little thing of it right there. Okay, so Caviola starts off by discussing previous readings of this text. He said that that Haushofer's contemporaries tended to moralize and pathologize it. The book, they tended to kind of talk about the morality discussed there and try to find issues with it. He claimed that his contemporaries aimed to correct those earlier rather narrow responses to the book, but that his contemporaries still only recognized direct social and political commentaries within the text, and they restricted their reading to just the feminist readings or post-apocalyptic Robinsonian components, so Robinson Crusoe. So his goal in his postmodern reading, self-proclaimed, was to illuminate these three elements in the book: the transparency of the wall, the length of the narrative, and the gratuitous character of the intrusion scene in the end. And he claimed that despite its superficial simplicity and accessibility, the book is in fact aesthetically very complex, and its significance surpasses a merely social or political reading. And so, like, this very complex, you tie that straight up here with the postmodern reading. So, he says the length of the narrative. Those are his words. I tend to lean towards this element being better described as the form of the narrative, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So, starting with the wall. The wall, according to Caviola, is more than a convenient deus ex machina to facilitate a trivial 20th century imitation of Robinson Crusoe. It indicates a mental and a geographical frontier. So this frontier or border is this border between what he considers two ontologically distinct spheres, or two distinct spaces of being, right, of reality. And he says there's the enclosure, within the enclosure, and then the outside world. And he says that he quotes the book when he says that this cataclysm that causes this wall is the result of man's compulsion to understand or know the world. Even the wall's this is from the book. Even the wall's creators didn't obey a free decision of the will, but simply followed their instinctive curiosity. That being said, we see that the narrator does not try to understand. She says, I was quite incapable of finding an explanation for it. I was neither concerned or desperate, and there would have been no sense in forcing myself into either state. Which is interesting because it is the opposite reaction of what she deems the wall's creators, right? She says that she's not going to try to understand it because she can't. So this concept of the frontier of the narrator's mind, this border between the ontological spheres that he's talking about, this border between illusion and reality, of the psychological and geographical, of the real and the phantasmagorical, he says at one point. It says that it's inflicted on her, these spheres are inflicted on her as a new world, subverting and erasing the basis of her previous social identity. Her previous and her new existence relate to each other like wakefulness and a dream. They're separated by this ontological wall. Then he says that it is significant that the wall is transparent because it's not something we can see. So she's got her social identity, her identity in the world that did exist, and then her identity within the wall. And that this wall is the separation between those. And then he said that the wall also acts as an allegory of the limited character of human knowledge. He says we see the world through the screen of our knowledge, which is language, but we cannot see the screen or know the foundation of our knowing. Now, if you've heard of Kenneth Burke before, that might remind you of his terministic screens. I have a little note there. Look it up if it's interesting to you, that concept, because it's an interesting rhetorical theory. And he mentions that she has to physically run into her new existence to become aware of it. So it's allegorical in the sense that her physical collision with the wall is her only way of knowing that it exists. Only this, and this concept of physicality associated with true knowledge is something that will come back later, and you'll recognize it when we talk about it. He says it's fundamental to her existence, and she accepts it and forgets it, kind of like subconsciousness or subconscious fear. Says that when she speculates about the nature of the wall, that confronts her with her own nature. As she says, was the wall not a confirmation of my childhood fears? Overnight, my formal life, everything I was fond of, had been mysteriously stolen from me. So in the way that we don't think about our subconsciousness, our subconscious fears, she does not think about the wall. She says that she just stopped trying to understand it, and he says that is a related concept. And then you get the narrative, and now he says the length of the narrative, but I really think this has, I feel like he would have been better to describe it as more of the form and content of the narrative itself. So the narrative, you've got a couple of things there. It has no chapters, and you have this thing that Haushofer does where she interrupts the narrative, which is a narrative of a past experience. She interrupts it and all of a sudden starts talking in the present tense about what she's doing now, how she feels now, the fact that she will never not have her loaded gun on the wall, things like this. But then she will also interrupt the narrative to discuss how her past, kind of before the wall, affected her situation within the wall. So basically, he says that the apocalypse has changed the nature of time into something subjective. After her alarm clock, previously set to crow time, has expired, she surrenders to the natural cycles and experience of time which is no longer mediated by man-made time. Thus, her ahistorical perception of time is crucial for her unquestioned acceptance of her fate, and on another level, responsible for the narrative itself. I guess it's lengthy because she only talks about a couple of things happening, but I think that dipping in and out of the present and the past is more emblematic of this ahistorical and subjective time that she all of a sudden becomes a part of. And then there's the contradictory nature of her report that she calls in this narrative. It's contradictory because it's a report, but she says that it's eventually going to become mouse food, eaten by mice. She doesn't, there's nobody left to read it. But yet at the same time, it still is, according to Caviola, cannot be divorced from its nature as communicative. So he says, in psychological terms, the relationship between writer and reader of the report oscillates between hostility and intimacy. The writer needs the reader as an imaginary addressee of her text. On the other hand, and that's because you can't have a report without reporting to someone, or a message without giving the message to someone. On the other hand, it does not matter whether the mice eat her report or a reader reads it. While the mice would destroy it physically, the reader would, by his mere existence, annihilate the text's truth, turn it into a fiction. So, truth, existence, reality, if there were a person to read it, then there would not have been an apocalypse. So he says there's this violent relationship between reader and narrator, kind of just endemic to this situation that she's writing. So it's contradictory. On the one hand, it's a report of the apocalypse, but on the other hand, if there's anybody to report to, then there hasn't been an apocalypse, is what Caviola is saying. It's postmodernism. Then you get the intrusion. This he calls another border, or border between ontological spheres, kind of like the wall. Like the intrusion is like the wall. So he says, in this ostentatiously wordless scene, the reader-writer relationship is acted out on a symbolic level. To read the Bericht, which is report or message, but it connotates two parties, a speaker and a receiver, communicator and receiver. To read the Bericht is to intrude and undermine, to belie and negate the integrity of the narrator's solipsistic universe. Solipsistic, being unable to know anything outside of the self, just only inwardly looking. So reading is killing or annihilating the report, just as the man kills two of the narrator's animal companions. The report enclosure attempts to preserve its integrity. To intrude in this way means to be killed. So there's the analogy for that reader-narrator relationship that she seems worried about, right? Okay, so how this intrusion scene, Caviola says, is supposed to be read as how the text is not to be approached. So she, in the book, mentions Menschenschrift und Menschenworten. I'm probably ruining those pronunciations, but I did my best. So, which means human writing and human words, and it looks off-putting when she writes it. She says that trying to express her experience in this human writing and human words just doesn't seem to fit. Which, according to Caviola, kind of is a reference to this estrangement and falsification to which her experience is exposed when codified in human language. She dreams instead of a more perfect writing, such as tracing her dreams in the moss or the snow, the stick or a stone. This physicality of recording this experience would ostensibly unify the reader and writer in the same space, because such a carving would be a direct expression and presentation, almost a realization in the physical world. The reader would become a fellow victim in the catastrophe by observing this more physical representation of the experience. So, in conclusion, Caviola says that the Divan, or the wall, aspires to be a transparent text, as transparent as the wall across the valley, allowing the reader to perceive through it the physical and emotional experience which has inspired it. She mentions this need to write, and this process of writing is to decrease the distance between the lived experience and its verbal recording. But in so doing, she can overcome the alienation and inaccessibility of the experience or knowledge. Remember, we talked about those screens and the inability to know how you know. By creating a shared extratemporal reality which transcends time and space through language, anyway. Ideally, the logic, this is Caviola here, ideally the logic of Marlon Haushofer's enclosure implies an experience in which writing and reading coincide in the same place and at the same time, in such a way that the writer, her text, and the reader no longer exclude but include each other, being united intimately in the experience of the enclosure. He says that the book aspires to be a transparent text, and overcome all of this. He says that this reading of the text, the narrator's communion with nature and her animals, contains the lesson as how she is willing to communicate with the reader. And that's where we talk about this old self and we, and she wants the reader to be part of that. And this is like an extended metaphor for what she is trying to accomplish with the author. So my response, it was interesting. All postmodern, criticisms they're oftentimes very interesting, but it can be so tedious to try to put this stuff together and wrap your head around it. Personally, I find, and it can get exhausting. I think of these postmodern critical dissections or deconstructions, would probably be the best description, like a puzzle. So imagine you took a picture of a boat and cut it into a jigsaw puzzle and then gave it to a postmodernist critic. They would like put it back together in a way that all the pieces fit, but they don't make a boat anymore. And that's impressive and correct because all the pieces fit, but it was a picture of a boat and now it's not. And I don't know, it feels like you're missing something by not looking at things at face value sometimes. And that's just my personal decision that I've come to over the years with postmodernism. Nice, interesting, but oy vey. But all this, what I really found interesting was digging into Caviola a little bit. So in 1990, he was an instructor of German and English at this university in Switzerland. And then in 91, he wrote this that I just read, as well as something called In the Zone. And then in 99, he writes this Word and Image Interactions, the Rhetoric of Interdisciplinarity. What's interesting is I couldn't find In the Zone, but I could find a review of it. And this review was so... you could just tell that Caviola is very, focused in his study, right? So this is excerpts from the review of this In the Zone, where he talks about how language can create space and how we react to spaces in terms of physical space, like the space within the enclosure. Disembodied perception in various texts allows intrusion into other spaces. Sound familiar? Like the reader would intrude into the enclosure, the narrative. Encapsulation, as she was encapsulated, on the other hand, is the logical and solipsistic result of the inability of language to communicate. So this fact that language just it doesn't convey the reality, which is what she was. And this is from a different text, but you can just see the relation here. Caviola analyzes the extensive use of allegory in postmodern texts, understood psychologically rather than structurally, as located in the self-consciousness of the reader, who grows aware of his or her role in creating the meaning of the text. The link here is that postmodern self-reflection is a fundamental characteristic of allegory. So again, just that whole his focus on this allegory and language and reality and construction. This was, I thought, a really good criticism of Caviola's writing, though, and I think that it applies probably to his article on the wall as well. The reviewer says, at times he sometimes jumps to conclusions rather quickly without fully developing his argument. The role of discourse is not adequately theorized in terms of representational strategies of space, and the impulse to interpretation rather than analysis and description often seems to govern his work. So he talks a lot about how he interprets a thing rather than, analysis and description within the narrative, within the writing, which I tend to agree with. But what's really interesting is what Mr. Caviola, or Dr. Caviola, is doing now. He works at this Center for Development Environment at the University of Bern in Switzerland, and the whole job, the whole purpose of the CDE is to advance innovative approaches in research and education that are appropriate for transforming highly complex sustainability problems into widely supported sustainable development pathways. So he's, if that was an eco novel, if the novel had all these ecological concerns, he's still in this, 30 years later. And his job here at CDE is to talk about how language can influence our perception of environments. And it's really interesting. He has this website here that I'm going to pull up if it'll work, but I'm obviously going to have to translate it because it is not in English. So this is his part of the CDE. He heads up this Sprachkompass. It's language compass, landscape and environment, an orientation guide that shows how language influences our perception of landscape and environment and influences our thoughts and action. I just thought that was such a poignant life path that he took from writing about this enclosure where he claims that language has such a big part of the construction of reality to now working for a company that helps to change our perception of the environment based on how we talk about it. Anyway, I thought it was pretty interesting. So that's it. Here are my citations. Sorry I went a little long, but I thought that end part was pretty interesting. Thanks.